Hello, my name is Lauren Hunter. I'm a writer and author, and I'm excited to share with you this breakout session today called My Story, Your Story, and God's Story. Thanks for making the time and the space to connect here. In September last year, I released my first book called Leaving Christian Science, 10 Stories of New Faith in Jesus Christ. And this session is sharing with you some of the common threads and themes that I saw as I interviewed and put together the stories that are in this book. Your journey is unique. We each have a story, and this story isn't finished. It's a work in process. You might be questioning Christian Science, or you may have already left. Some of you may have left years ago or recently. But regardless of your path, you have a story to tell, and your journey has the ability to impact yourself as well as impact others. I've used some quotes from authors and various people throughout this presentation. I've always loved this one from Oscar Wilde, who is a playwright and author. Be yourself. Everyone else is taken. I remember I saw one of those cute little signs for your home with this quote in it in a store, and I immediately snapped a picture and put it on my Instagram. It spoke to me because many of us who come out of Christian Science often wrestle with identity issues. That's a fairly common thread, and we'll talk about more common threads. But I just want to urge you, as you listen and kind of soak up and take in this presentation, that you start to think of yourself as a highly valued individual. And it's awesome that those of us who are questioning and have left Christian Science, we share a lot of things in common, which should give you some comfort. But also know that you are a unique individual, and that is a wonderful thing. So I'm excited to talk more about the common threads. Now, I will give you kind of a caution. Some of these are going to be hard to hear. You might resonate with one or two, or maybe all of them. All of the things that we talk about in the FFCS conference, nothing is super wonderful and easy. It's a difficult journey that each of us has been on. My own journey has been quite difficult. With that in mind, one common thread, and this came out of chapter 1 in my book, Linda Kramer's story. She's also a presenter at the conference. Her story focused on matter. While writing the book, a lot of different themes emerged. This concept of dual reality is one that almost all Christian scientists tend to wrestle with. If you haven't wrestled with this, don't feel left out. But Linda describes it really well in the chapter. She says, Christian Science is more than a set of doctrinal beliefs. It is a different view of reality. Many of you will remember the scientific statement of being. That basically is a mantra many Christian scientists have memorized. We repeat it in the church services, are taught it as children. And it states that the material world isn't real, that the only things that are real are spiritual. So that causes many of us to have a difficulty in adjusting back and forth between the material world isn't real, and at the same time, it is real because our five senses, our actual physical body tells us that it's real. So there's a disparity between those two things, and many of us have to do what I call mental gymnastics to jump over or flip over that shift between, in your mind, trying to hold fast to the thought that things are not material while experiencing that the world is material. Seems funny when you say it out loud, but it is quite a difficult thing to navigate. Another common thread, this is from my chapter, which tells my story, Journey Out of Christian Science, about the body and medical treatment. I was amazed, not in the healing power of Christian Science, but in the simple, effective medication to treat my so-called metaphysical body. For me, I had a kind of a life-altering event when, and I'll share a little bit more about my story later, when I did seek medical treatment and my problems were resolved. That was crazy because all of a sudden I thought, oh my gosh, all these years I've been trying to hold that my body isn't real, it's metaphysical. Yet when I had problems I couldn't solve and healing didn't work and I went to the ER doctors were able to give me antibiotics that healed me. So that was like a big turning point for me. Many of us have guilt and shame over trying medicine when healings didn't happen, whether it was like taking an Advil for menstrual cramps. I had a friend who said, you know, it's pretty easy to take an Advil and not have menstrual cramps. And that was an early on indicator that, you know, this whole division between flesh and spirit was not going to work for me long term. Some of us have shame over imperfections in our health, as well as imperfections in beauty. You know, we're taught to focus in on the principles of perfection and that, you know, we're a child of God and God only sees us as perfect. That actually isn't biblical. It doesn't match up to the Bible, which many of you know this. But so if Mary Baker Eddy is purporting to get her inspiration from the Bible, many of the things that she teaches are actually contradictory to the Bible, so there's a problem there. Another way that people tend to cope is to dissociate. That's a psychological term. They kind of cut off the sensation or the acknowledgement of their physical needs, including noticing pain, anxiety, or fear. They might break down or just ignore or deny what's actually going on and sort of float away mentally. That's kind of how I feel when I can tell that it's happening to me. Usually there's something difficult that I'm having to navigate, an emotion or feeling or pain, and my mind is kind of able to drift away. And so learning how to reconnect the mind with the body is a very new thing for most of us because we've spent our whole life disconnecting on purpose, disconnecting the physical body from our spiritual mind or our thoughts. Many of us also have trouble recognizing boundaries and physical limits or mental limits or time limits. We also have trouble identifying our own needs. So these are common things that I saw not only, you know, as I shared my story, but in lots of other conversations with people who have left or were questioning Christian Science. Another common thread is the concept of receiving love. In Jessica's chapter about God, she endured some very difficult abuse situations, both from her mother and an external abuse situation, and the love was not there from her mother. And this is also something pretty common as I've talked to people who have made their way out of CF. There is somewhat of a disconnect between that innate kind of maternal love that is sort of built into moms. If you're a mom, you know this. It's like nothing can hold you back. I've heard it called like the mama bear syndrome, you know, where you just go all out to protect your child or to save them or to help them. And because of the disconnect between the physical and the spiritual worldviews of Christian Science, there does seem to be kind of a buffer for a lot of mothers and fathers. But instead of comforting a child who's just had their knee scraped or fallen down, the tendency is to deny, right? To tell them that their skin knee isn't real, to tell them that the pain that they, you know, as they were bullied at school, that wasn't real. So in essence, it's like completely devaluing, you know, your experience as a child. So that is tough because that little child endures a lot of like emotional abuse. It doesn't seem like abuse, but it definitely, for a lot of us, it does resonate that way in our hearts. And then, you know, fast forward and we have to work through those issues of, you know, abandonment or not receiving love as a child. So those are all common issues there. Another big one is denial. You know, there's a lot of language in Science and Health about denial or denying. Usually denial is not a good thing, but in the CS worldview, you're denying that there's actual evil in the world. You're denying that there's a connection between our healing success rate and our faith. Denying the problem, but then also not being healed, it creates kind of a schism. It can make some people, go crazy, really, because they can't fill in the gaps between seeing something, telling themselves it's not real, and then experiencing something totally different, like dying of cancer, or watching somebody close die of something, or experiencing a physical problem that isn't healed. There's also denial of emotions, which is really difficult to relearn as an adult. But denial of anger, of sadness, of anxiety, and on the opposite side, like being overtly happy or overly happy or excited. It's sort of like you just kind of ride the wave right in the middle of this placid kind of false sense of happiness almost. There's also an overemphasis on being grateful, almost as a cover-up for unhealed illnesses or unresolved issues. I kind of struggled with that. A friend gave me a book on gratitude, and just recently, and I kind of bristled. Like I can't just focus on gratitude. I have to be able to acknowledge when I'm sad and when I'm angry, and if I just skip ahead over those emotions and just jump to being grateful, it feels very false and feels very much like Christian Science to me. So that's one area where I kind of resonated with that issue of being overly grateful or overly thankful. There's also a denial of traumatic events or experiences, everything from small accidents to large turmoil and trouble and traumatic issues. So kind of seeing that all across the board. This quote comes from Katie's chapter 4, which focuses on the topic of sin. I could articulate all the Christian Science tenets from memory, yet I was unable to explain how they could be applied to life in general and specifically to my life. In Katie's chapter, she talks about 9/11 and how that was a turning point for her because she couldn't rectify the Christian Science worldview that there was no evil, and then see the evil, on TV and the news reports and the people who died and the evil people who perpetrated this horrible terrorist attack on our country. And those two things didn't make sense and couldn't be in the same worldview. So whatever tipping point you've experienced, just know that there are others out there who've experienced many of the same things that you have, and I hope that brings you comfort. Here are a few more common threads. Struggle to fit the mold of Christian Science as an adult, disbelief when family or church members died suddenly with no explanation, arrogance and elitism that Christian Science was the only truth that was acceptable, refusal to renounce Mary Baker Eddy as an enlightened leader, difficulty in understanding the Trinity, trouble letting go of debilitating thought patterns, and difficulty in trusting people in authority. That is another one that I still wrestle with. I'm skeptical and I'm afraid that I'm going to be duped because I felt that I was duped in believing what Mary Baker Eddy taught. So that's a big one. There's always threads that kind of float to the top as really common, really difficult. And then it's always interesting to talk to people and hear the other ways that Christian Science impacted them and what they're wrestling with. There's definitely a variety of experience. You are not alone. Whatever your pain points are with Christian Science, you are not alone. Others, like me and like those I've interviewed, have experienced similar issues. Hopefully this brings you comfort in knowing that you're not alone. This is a quote from the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. In God's economy, nothing is wasted. Through failure, we learn a lesson in humility, which is probably needed, painful though it is. I like this quote because often it feels like in the middle of difficult circumstances or pain, that it's a waste and that you're, not being useful or you're not focusing your efforts on things that are good. And that, can be kind of a remnant of Christian Science worldview. But I hope that it brings you comfort in knowing that, nothing is wasted, that our experiences can even the painful ones and the difficult ones, they can bring about healing. They can cause humility that forces us to look at ourselves authentically, and those are all valuable things. A little bit about my story. I was raised a fourth-generation Christian Zionist, although recently found out that there's actually a fifth generation on my dad's side that I didn't know about. So that's interesting. Ancestry.com provided that. Began questioning in my early 20s. I did go to private Christian elementary school up through sixth grade in Louisiana, where I was raised. And so I'd heard the sinner's prayer and been to chapel, and like I had a sense of what mainstream Christianity was like, and I couldn't quite figure it out when I was a kid and didn't really talk to my parents about that. But when I started dating my husband, we were seniors in high school, we started dating. His mother was an ICU nurse. Fast forward a few years, I had a urinary tract infection, which I didn't know what it was then, but I had just prayed and had a practitioner help me, and nothing ended up helping. And instead I got worse and worse. My husband scooped me up and was like, we're going to the ER. Finally, I gave in. He took me to the ER. They got the drip IV going with antibiotics, and it was a pretty quick turnaround from on the floor, crying, to resting in a hospital bed and being cared for so well by nurses and doctors. What's really impressed upon me was all of the negative stuff I had heard, that doctors and nurses in hospitals, you get sicker, or their care really isn't that great. I just experienced this incredible amount of love and attention and care in a way that I never had before. And so it was really quite eye-opening, and I felt super grateful for my husband persisting and taking me to the ER. This is me down here in the white pinafore over the red. And this is my, everyone is a Christian Zionist in here except for like one, I'm trying to think who, my great grandmother in the green, right in the middle. She was Methodist and actually raised my grandmother's Methodist, and my grandmother converted. She was a singer and sang in all the churches, and she was afraid of doctors, and she liked that Christian Science didn't go to the doctor, so she converted to Christian Science. So after my hospital episode, I ended up taking a new position at a company called Christianity.com, and suddenly I was surrounded by all of these Christians, born-again Christians, and there were several pastors on staff who were doing various things for the company. And I realized there was kind of a big difference between my religious beliefs and what they believed. And so it was very eye-opening, and it was nothing anybody said to me. It was very experiential. Then I had a call with a reporter. He kind of snuffed out the King James Version. We were talking about downloading the Bible on a Palm Pilot, which this is back in 2001. And he asked if what religion I was, and I said Christian Science. And he said, "Oh, you've got to get out of that." He sent me to then website Christian Way. And I actually spoke with Linda Kramer, this is 20 years ago. And it was really incredible. It was really difficult. I felt like a spell had been broken for me. And I went to the library. I checked out all these books. The Kingdom of the Cults was one on the shelf by Walter Martin. I realized that Christian Science was identified as a cult in this book of religious cults. I read a lot of other books. It was a very turbulent 2-3 days. And at the end of it, I was convicted to give my life to Jesus Christ and be saved. Now, I kind of knew about that because of working at Christianity.com. I kind of had it in the back of my mind from the school I was raised going to through sixth grade. This past year in April, I celebrated 20 years out of Christian Science. So now I want to focus on you. And I'm going to ask you some questions. If you have a notebook or a piece of paper and you want to take notes, you can do that, or you can just sit quietly and kind of think. But I want you to take inventory. What did you notice growing up in Christian Science? Did you agree or accept everything you learned? Or did you have doubts? Did you willingly attend Christian Science camps, Sunday school, and Wednesday night testimony meetings? Or did your parents force you to go? Or did you go as an adult? How did you internalize the fundamental teaching that matter isn't real and sin, disease, and death weren't real? Did these principles make sense to you? If you had doubts, did you confess them to anyone, like a school friend or someone outside of Christian Science? Or did your parents ever ask you? Did you ever confess any doubts to them? What events can you recall that caused you to start doubting? Did you have any unresolved health issues that caused you to seek medical attention? Did other kids question you for not receiving vaccinations? Did you witness a loved one dying from lack of medical care? Or did you visit someone you loved in a Christian Science nursing facility and realize they weren't even administering any kind of medical care? Did you ever read the Bible outside the blue chalk lines and find that the Bible conflicted with science and health? You'll see an image here of the blue chalk lines outlining scripture. For those of you who don't have a background in Christian Science, we weren't really supposed to read beyond those blue chalk lines. We were supposed to stay right there and read the selected passages and then the corresponding selected passages of science and health with key to the scripture. Did many of your childhood needs often go unmet? Did you feel an inability to recognize and name your emotions and ask for what you needed? What other doubts and questions went through your mind or still go through your mind? For those of you that have had doubts and experienced doubts and then received some kind of confirmation of those doubts, this section is for you. Did you use medicine and or doctors and resolve your needs like I did? I had unresolved physical problems. I engaged in practitioner's care. I prayed myself. I went to church. I did all the correct things that I should have done as a good Christian Scientist, and yet I still didn't have healings. Have you admitted your doubts to someone you trust? Did you pray to God and receive confirmation that Christian Science was false? Have you encountered signs or repeated interactions with former Christian Scientists that seem coincidental? For me, when I left, which was pretty abrupt, and I happened to be like the clerk secretary and was on the board, and quickly wrote a letter of resignation and read it in a board meeting. And then I also sent a letter to the mother church dissolving my membership. It was very fast and furious and must have seemed very abrupt to those around me. God kept putting people in my path, including a neighbor. I was filling up a laundry basket full of journals and Christian Science periodicals that I was, we're all taught to keep those and make space on the shelf indefinitely for all of these periodicals. One of the first things I did when I had that turn and I felt like the spell was broken of Christian Science, I loaded up this laundry basket, filled it up, and left my second floor apartment and walked down around the corner to the dumpsters. I was dumping those into the dumpster when my neighbor came to dump her trash. She said, "What you dumping there?" And I said, "Oh, a bunch of church materials that I don't believe in anymore." She says, "Oh, what church?" I said, "Christian Science." She said, "Oh, you need to stop by our apartment when you're done." And I did. I put the laundry basket back and I went and knocked on their door. They lived directly beneath me. And they shared that her husband, he shared with me that he was raised in Christian Science and had left. And they were now Bible-believing Christians. And that was one of the first ways that I felt kind of a confirmation from God that I'd done the right thing, because this happened like immediately after. And so wherever you're at, kind of in that faith journey or spiritual journey, not to get wishy-washy that you should be looking for signs, but that is one of the ways that God kind of confirms things. So it's always interesting to kind of observe what's going on around you during times of great turmoil. A vital part of deconstructing, which is a critical analysis of your beliefs, includes getting support outside the Christian Science community. There's a lot of different support options. If you're here at the FFCS conference here in 2021, you're already taking steps to find that support, so good job. And if you're here watching on the YouTube channel, you're also taking steps to find yourself good support, so great job. For myself, therapy has helped quite a bit. I interviewed 3 different counselors over the internet during COVID, and it was very clear to me that one stood out and was someone I wanted to work with. I specifically looked up trauma-informed therapists who had a background in religious trauma or destructive groups or mind control groups, and that's how I found my therapist. I've made incredible strides just in the past couple of years. Even though I've had lots of therapy in the past, I didn't know to look for these specifically trained therapists in trauma-informed care. Another way to find good help and support would be support groups. And the FFCS is partnered with the xchristianscience.com Facebook group to form a great Get Wise initiative. And this is a secular, non-Christian, seeker-friendly, if you want to say, support group where everyone is welcome at whatever place in their journey they are. And so that group has been really wonderful, and there's always new groups starting up. Another helpful way to grow and support yourself as you're questioning is to seek good resources, and books are a fabulous resource. Combating Cult Mind Control by Steve Hassan is a non-religious book. He is a leading cult expert. He goes through the BITE model, which simplifies Clifton's model, which is described more in Linda Kramer's book, Perfect Peril. But he goes through the various aspects of mind control and how that is related to religious groups. It's a very helpful book. Linda's book, Perfect Peril, really dissects mind control and Christian Science. And as a former Christian Scientist herself, she's able to articulate things in a way that really speaks to Christian Scientists. The Kingdom of the Cults Handbook is a newer version of the original Kingdom of the Cults. It's a shorter book, but has descriptions of the various groups, religious groups, and Christian Science specifically. It's very helpful to read. God's Perfect Child is another helpful book. And then my own book, it was published last year. I hope that you might find that helpful as well. There's lots of others. I'm just noting a few of the key books here as a good place to start. A word of advice. Leaving Christian Science takes courage, bravery, and conviction. It's not easy to connect the problems from your upbringing to the faith your family so lovingly bequeathed to you. They meant well, but Christian Science has damaged you. And that's a tough thing to accept. This quote from Robert Liparolo. Bravery is not the absence of fear, but the forging ahead despite being afraid. An important point to remember is that the trouble you're experiencing right now is not your fault. I'm going to say that again. The trauma that you've experienced in Christian Science is not your fault. As you're thinking about the effects CS has had on your life, it's important to remember this, that something has happened to you, and this isn't your fault. Trauma occurs when something is done to you. Processing your journey out of Christian Science is important to the reconstruction process. This quote from Sharon Salzberg says, quote, "Someone who has experienced trauma also has gifts to offer all of us in their depths, their knowledge of our universal vulnerability, and their experience of the power of compassion." I think the biggest blessing you can give yourself is to give yourself compassion as you're going through this process. It's incredibly hard. It's incredibly difficult on a number of fronts. So be kind to yourself, have compassion to yourself, and love yourself as you are undoing the damage of Christian Science. Your journey starts here. For those of you interested in writing your own story, I'm going to be working on an additional presentation and book called Write Your Journey. And so this is just a little short overview of how one might go about writing their story. Writing is often a cathartic way to process. So even if you would never consider sharing your story, it could be helpful to you to journal about your story, to journal about what's happened to you, just in order to process it all. After this session is over, I encourage you to watch it again and review the slides. Go through and write down important events that are part of your CS journey. Pick one or two major doubts that you had and detail the reasons why these were instrumental in your leaving CS. Describe your emotions and include dialogue if you can. Internal dialogue would be something that you were thinking, like I said to myself, how could I have believed this? And external dialogue would be quoting someone else speaking to you. The middle section of your story is where you should pick one big event that was a catalyst for you to begin leaving or to exit completely. Show, don't tell. You might remember from your high school or middle school English teacher hitting you over the head with a ruler saying, show, don't tell. That just means to describe events or situations that are happening instead of telling me how you experienced it. Share your emotions. Be authentic and be vulnerable. Use first-person language to describe what happened. Detail the hard stuff. Don't skip or gloss over suffering or difficulties. That's something that we were taught to do in Christian Science. But as we're rebuilding ourselves with a more normal worldview, we don't want to skip over the difficult suffering portions of our story. In the end, you can walk us through how the events you chose to share caused you to leave CS. If you've had a conversation or a conversion with someone about another faith, include your details here because that's an important part of your journey. Wrap up your story on a high note if possible. It doesn't have to be that everything was, perfect and wonderful, but just that you're growing and you feel like you're in a better place, or you feel encouraged that you're on the right path now. Now we're going to switch just slightly to talk about God's story. Now I know you might be watching this and you might really be struggling with having faith in a higher power. And that is okay. And that is pretty normal for those people like myself who've left a destructive group and a high control group. It's pretty normal to struggle with any kind of new faith because we've been traumatized, we've been hurt by a religious group. So trusting another religious group feels very vulnerable, not in a good way. But I just want to encourage you that, it is helpful. And even if your faith is just in a higher power that is watching out for you, I do believe that God is watching out for us and has our good purposes and healing in mind. Taking the steps to leave is often the hardest part. But wherever you are in your faith journey, whether you could never imagine believing in God again or belonging to a church again, or if you are trying to sort out what is biblical or historical Christianity and how does it compare to Christian Science, any number of these trajectories are completely valid. Rediscovering your authentic identity will be hard, but it's really worthwhile. Brené Brown, one of my favorite nonfiction authors, says, authenticity is the daily practice of letting go of who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we are. Trusting in a higher power can help as you navigate your life after Christian Science. If you have a thirst to better understand historical Christianity and the God of the Bible, or if you've already shifted your faith and are untangling the bad theology of the CS cult, God is with you in this process. It's messy, it's complicated, but God can and will answer you if you ask questions. Let's put it all together. It's okay to be confused, to have doubts, and to be uncertain about how your journey out of Christian Science will resolve. Remember, it's the journey and not the end. Your story is important. Your story is valuable. Your story matters. We are all in this process together. St. Teresa of Avila has been quoted saying, "The feeling remains that God is on the journey too." Wherever you are in your journey out of Christian Science, please know that there's hope and there's value, and your journey is valid. We're all in this together, and I'm really thankful that you stuck it through to listen to this presentation to the end. And if you ever want to contact me, feel free to reach out. My website is laurenhunter.net, LAURENHUNTER.net. And there's a contact page there. Please feel free to email me or reach out through social media as well. Thanks again for your time, and I wish you the best on this journey.